Welcome to you. We are on our last Sunday of 6 weeks of Revelation, and I'm not sure whether I am a little sad or a little relieved. Maybe you are too. But hopefully over the last 6 weeks, your understanding of this book, its context, its meaning for today has become much clearer, and no doubt by the end of the day today, you will still have many questions, and that's okay. That's part of being on this learning journey together. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to remind you, Adult Forum, though we will not be talking about Revelation, will continue next week. On Sunday, the 11th of November, we are celebrating Veterans Day, and we will be delighted to welcome Jeff Franco, who is a retired Army National Guard chaplain, as well as retired pastor, who will be talking about life beyond the yellow ribbon and what it's like for our soldiers and their families, and what churches and individuals can do to help. So I invite you to come next Sunday as we welcome Pastor Franco to meet us. Today, however, we are glad to take a look at what this book of Revelation not only has meant for us in the past, but really means for us going forward. And we have in our midst today Professor Eric Barreto from Luther Seminary. Dr. Barreto is a fairly new faculty member. He's been at the seminary for about 4 years. And as he said, I'm so excited to come. You have invited a Baptist to talk about Revelation and the end times. So we will be looking forward to hearing what he has to say about what it means to live with that sense of eschatological hope and anticipation. And without further ado, I introduce to you Dr. Eric Barreto.
Good morning, everybody. Happy to be here with you this morning to talk about, I think, a book that's often neglected, I think, in a lot of churches, but so often overemphasized in a lot of other churches. And I think both of those extremes are problematic, and I hope we can find a happy medium, I think, that is faithful to this text, but also faithful to this tradition that was so important to Jesus and to the early church. So, end times are always around. They're in the news, especially in the last couple years. If you go way back, there was Y2K, the world was supposed to end then. We have this example here from, apparently the world ended about a year ago. I don't know if you noticed or not. Anybody remember this, what the story here was? Yeah. It was Harold Camping, who looked at the scriptures and said, "It is clear to me that Jesus is going to come back on May 21st, 2011. Harold Camping was neither the first nor the last person to make these kind of claims. If you look through the history of the church, people do this all the time. You figure by now they'd figure out if you set a date, you're probably going to be wrong. Right? But he did this. I think we look at things like this, and I think properly think it's kind of funny. The kind of ways that people can delude themselves, the ways that people can invest themselves in such a crazy idea. But I think also we need to stop just a second and think about this a little more. I read a newspaper story right around the time that Harold Camping's prophecies were big on the news. That there was a transit worker in New York City who had $160,000 left in retirement. Okay.
Hold it right up here.
All right, I want to make sure everybody can hear. He had $160,000 left in his retirement account and became so convinced by what Harold Camping had to say that he liquidated all his assets so he could buy advertising on the buses and subways of New York City to warn his neighbors about the coming judgment day. At that point, it gets a lot less funny. It becomes serious. It becomes something that somebody really committed themselves to, really believed, but they were deceived. I think that is a good example of why we as Christians need to embrace this part of our faith. Because for far too long, people have been out there abusing these ideas and really hurting people along the way. So end times are all over the news. It's going to come up in a couple months as well. Should I stay in one place for the video? Is that helpful? Perfect. All right. There's apparently some Mayan prophecies coming up in December too as well, that the world is supposed to end at that point as well. But apparently the Mayans didn't have leap years, so the date is already actually passed, so we're safe, don't worry about this. But what alternatives do we have? Now, you also notice that it's not just in the news, it's also in our entertainment. Right? That for some reason, we like to spend $9 per person to go see movies that destroy the world. I want to give you one example of this. This is the movie Deep Impact from 1998. I don't know if you remember back to the summer of 1998. There were two movies that came out within a month of each other, both of which were destroying the world. There was Deep Impact and there was Armageddon. Have anybody seen these? Or all right. So I want to show you the trailer to remind you something about this movie, and then I want to ask you a couple questions about this. So first, let's watch the trailer and think back to what life was like in 1998. That was like yesterday, right? Sometimes feels that way. All right.
Are we on? Are we on?
We're on, Mr. President.
A few minutes ago, the United States ambassadors to every country in the world told the leaders of those nations what I'm about to tell you. Comments are still headed for Earth. Now, we've been planning for the worst, so I hope you'll bear with me and listen to what I have to say. To ensure the continuation of our way of life, we've been preparing a network of immense caves, and we can put 1 million people in them, underground, for 2 years. On August 10th, we're going to hold a national lottery. A computer will randomly select 800,000 Americans to join the 200,000 scientists, teachers, soldiers, and artists who have already been chosen. In addition, the United States and Russia have been building the largest spaceship ever constructed to stop the comets. We will prevail. Life will go on.
A bit more flourishing. Yeah, heaven and earth are about to collide. Right. All right. So just take 2 minutes. Turn to the person next to you, and think about these two questions. One is, what does this movie tell us about our fears and our hopes for the future, and what does it tell us about how this movie seems to think we should prepare for the end? How do you get ready for the end according to this movie? All right, so just take a minute or two and turn to your neighbor. I want to hear some responses here in a second. I hate to stop good conversation, but what did you talk about? Let's just hear some of the comments, some of the things that you shared with one another. Their preparation, it was purely secular. I gotta say, when they didn't say anything about professors or clergy, I became very concerned. They should be on top of that. No, I'm just kidding. But yeah, but it was, there was a sense, there was faith and hope and love somewhere kind of tucked in, but it wasn't at the forefront. It was more practical, right? How do we keep civilization going? Well, we get soldiers and maybe a few artists too. That's nice too, but. How do we keep going? That was the main question. It's how do we perpetuate ourselves in the future? Good. Others? Yeah. We will survive. And what did you gather from that? Yeah. Of course we'll survive, right? I think there is this sense, it goes even beyond hope and goes beyond optimism. It's this kind of blind faith that we're just going to keep on going. Right? And if we have the right technology, if we do the right things, we'll continue going forward and forward. Good. Others? Yeah.
We had an interesting discussion at our table in that if you aren't one of those chosen, then you get to go to heaven right away. They didn't like the idea of trying to survive underground for 2 years. They'd rather just,
So it might be better just to not get picked, right? And just kind of get things over with right away. Yeah. Yeah.
It's happened before. Only we are the dinosaurs.
This kind of, it's happened before, only we are the dinosaurs is the comment. that, you know, there's these cycles that if we look at the history of the world and geological studies, we know eventually the sun's going to burn out, right? It's going to be a long time from now, don't worry about it. But that there's these natural cycles of life and death here on the earth. Good. A couple things that I've shown this video clip a couple times, and I've gotten lots of interesting things. One thing to remember is what was the economy like in 1998? It was right before the bubble, but things were pretty good. We weren't at war. It was we might call it a Pax Americana. The economy was going well. We weren't in Iraq. The war on terror was still kind of a few years away. Things were going well. And yet there are two movies this summer that people go and be entertained by the end of the world. Interesting. Somebody else pointed out that this was about a few years before 9/11. And that maybe we can't watch a movie like this quite the same way. That the notion of the world being destroyed, of everything that we know falling apart, is entertaining only when it's not really possible. Right? Only when it's kind of something that happens in the movie theaters and not in real life. So again, I think that says something about where we are as a people. I'm fascinated by my own religious tradition that we have so many people concerned with the end of the world, when so many of us have very comfortable and very good lives. So why is it that so many Americans are looking forward to the return of Jesus when the world is going to be turned upside down, right? When they're doing so well? Right? In Acts, it says that the Christians were turning the world upside down. That sounds like a great idea, unless you're at the top of the world, and then that's going to be turned upside down. So what's happening with us? All right, so that was 1998. Fast forward about 15 years to last year's Super Bowl, and we get a slightly different version of this. So one more video clip, and then we're going to jump into the text a little bit about it. 2012 Mayan apocalypse on the newspaper.
Where's Dave? Dave didn't drive the longest lasting, most dependable truck on the road. Dave drove before him. Twinkie? Chevy Silverado. Beginning of your workday, end of the world.
So a really different take on the end, right? What's different? What's happened in 15 years? What's been, so think about this. This is during the Super Bowl this last year. Well, Chevy was resurrected. That's one thing. There was this little auto bailout that helped make this commercial possible. What's that? You can do an ad about the end of the world, right? I mean, there's this playfulness about this that is really interesting. And again, what I find really interesting is that in 2012, we're in the middle of an economic recession and in the midst of all these wars and terrorism, and yet we think this is funny, right? There's this playfulness to it, right? How do you survive the end according to this? Get a Chevy. You have the right toy. You have the right stuff, and apparently you have to be like this ruggedly handsome guy. That's all the people that survive. So two very different perspectives on this. Two very different things that have happened here. Why are we so concerned about the end of the world? What do these movies, what do these commercials tell us? I think there are 5 things that I would point to that I think might frame our discussion this morning. One is, I think in our culture, there's a sneaking suspicion that something is seriously wrong. That something is wrong with the world, something is amiss. Right? Second, then, I think we have a sneaking suspicion that our sins are worthy of punishment. That somehow we kind of earn what's coming to us, that the sense of judgment is something that we've earned, that we brought upon ourselves. We can think about this not just in movies and in commercials, but even the ways that we think about environmental issues, and think about a movie like Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth. and those kind of ideas. There's a sense in which there's something wrong with the world, and we've kind of brought it upon ourselves. Right? I think this is some of the stuff that's floating in the culture. Third is that I think there's a lot of fear in our culture as well. A lot of anxiety about the future, a lot of anxiety about what's coming next. As I was driving down, I saw a lot of political signs on the highway, including a lot saying, we're going to take America back. All right? There's this fear that there's something being lost, okay? And it's going to be irretrievable, and we need to get it back. Fourth, at the same time of all this fear and anxiety, I think there's also a buried hope that we can all rally around one another, and that in the end, courage will win. So when you think about these apocalyptic movies, think about Independence Day or other movies like that, what always happens near the end of the story at its crescendo, usually the president will give up and give this big rousing speech, and everybody gathers together, and some people will sacrifice so that we all might live. And I think there's this hope that we're all going to rally together when it really comes down to it. And last is the question I already broached, but I think I want us to really keep on thinking about today, is why would a people blessed with so much hope for the world, why would people blessed with so much hope for the world to be turned upside down? Why would we as Christians want the world to be changed when in a lot of ways the world is really working very well for us? And that's the big question I want to ask today. An imminent expectation of the end was an important part of the faith of the early church. It was an important part of Jesus' own faith. It was an important part of Paul's own faith. It was an important part of the faith of the early church. And of course, 2,000 years later, it's hard to have that same kind of imminent expectation, that imminent hope that the world is going to be changed. But I would suggest to you that we miss something very important at the very core of Christian faith when we don't pay attention to these issues. Like I said earlier, in some churches, too much attention is paid to these issues. I would be bold enough to say, I think, that in a lot of mainline churches that I've been a part of, both Baptist and Lutheran and lots of others, we look at what some of our Christian brothers and sisters are doing with Revelation, and we just want nothing to do with it. And what we do, instead of rereading Revelation in a new way, is we just don't read it. We don't deal with it. And I think that's problematic. I think we can do better than that. If you remember one thing today, is I think the one very important thing to remember about the way the New Testament thinks about the end is the emphasis it places on the community of faith, on life lived together as sisters and brothers. For the New Testament, thinking about the end is not esoteric or otherworldly so much. It's not about what's out there. It's not so much about the future. Instead, the New Testament, when it thinks about the end, it clarifies what life today looks like. It thinks about the future so we can think about how we live today. The future is in service of the present, not the other way around. And I think so many of Christians have gotten this precisely wrong and thought so much about the future. They don't think about, if this is the kind of God that we worship, the kind of God that we serve, and this is the kind of future that God has in store for us, what does that mean for how we live today? We don't get to just sit around and wait for that to happen. We get to take part in what God is doing in God's future. All right, so how do we think about the end times today? I would suggest a couple things. One is that eschatology is not an opiate for the masses. That is, eschatology should not be an excuse for us to sit around and wait for what's going to happen next. What eschatology is, it's supposed to energize us and lead us into God's future, propel us into doing good works, and then kind of joining together as a community of faith. Eschatology can help us think about what's ultimately important. It can sharpen our vision, fill out our hopes, and express our deepest fears. Again, if this is God's future, what would our present look like today? For too long, I think, we have ceded the theological ground to fanciful eschatological dreamers who treat the living Word of God as a mere puzzle to be solved. This happens so often with Revelation, that it's this puzzle that if you just get the right combinations right, you can figure out when exactly things are going to happen. But no more. I want to pose a challenge for all of us this morning. It's for us to return to that sense of expectation that imbued the faith of Jesus and his earliest followers with so much power. I think the first thing we need to do then is to widen our imagination about what the end looks like. in Revelation is a natural place to start, but I think there are other texts in the Bible that I think will help us sharpen our vision and help us think about how we think about Revelation and how we think about eschatology. So the first place I would turn is 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians is probably the oldest book we have in the New Testament. It's probably written around the year 40 or 45 by the Apostle Paul. And in it we get a glimpse into what the faith of this early church was very much like. If you look at, for example, if you have a Bible, you can take a look at this, where I'll just read some of the stuff to you. Chapter 1, verses 9 through 10, set the tone of the whole letter. And Paul writes, "For the people of those regions report about us, what kind of welcome we had among you, and how you turned to God from idols to serve a living and true God, and to wait for his Son from heaven, whom he raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the wrath that is coming." So the tone of the letter is an encouraging word. If you can compare this, for example, to the beginning of Galatians, like Paul starts yelling at them right away. He just jumps right in and starts berating them. 1 Thessalonians is more kind of like a father writing to his children, or a mother writing to a daughter. It's this sense of nurture and care. The stuff I want to talk about particularly starts in chapter 4. In chapter 4, Paul starts thinking a bit about the end. So he says at the beginning of chapter 4, "Finally, brothers and sisters, we ask and urge you in the Lord Jesus that as you learn from us how you ought to live and to please God, as in fact you are doing, you should do so now more and more." And for the rest of the chapter 4, if you take a look at it this afternoon, he gives instructions about how to live as Christians together. For example, in verse 9, he starts saying, "Now concerning love of the brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves have been taught by God to love one another. And indeed you love all the brothers and sisters throughout Macedonia. But we urge you, beloved, to do so more and more, to aspire to live quietly, to mind your own affairs, and to work with your hands as we directed you, so that you may behave properly toward outsiders and be dependent on no one." Now, in my Bible, there's a gap then between verses 12 and 13. It's almost as if, now Paul's going to talk about something new, because it sure sounds that way, because in verse 13 he says, "But we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about those who have died, so that you may not grieve as others do, but have as others who have no hope." He'll go on to talk about that although some of your members of your church have died, right, Jesus is going to bring them back. The resurrection is going to happen for them as well. Now, I think what often happens is that we separate out those commandments that Paul has at the beginning of chapter 4 about how we live together, and then all this other stuff about the dead and being raised, to us sounds like two different topics. For Paul, they were one and the same. So he talks about the concerns about the dead in order to encourage them and exhort them to love one another that much more deeply. So he talks about this then at the beginning of chapter 5. "Now concerning the times and seasons, brothers and sisters, you do not need to have anything written to you. For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night." Now that sounds really scary, right? Nobody wants a thief showing up in the middle of the night. That's why we have alarms and the police we can call, right? But notice what Paul does. "For you yourself, when they say there's peace and security, then sudden destruction will come upon them, as labor pains come upon a pregnant woman, and there will be no escape." Now notice one thing that Paul does here very subtly is that when they say there's peace and security, this is something that the Roman Empire says a lot. We are bringing you peace and security. But how do they bring that? They bring peace and security with a huge military and an oppressive hand. Okay? So he's kind of saying that peace and security that Rome is promising you is false. Okay? "But you," verse 4, "beloved, are not in darkness for that day to surprise you like a thief." We shouldn't be surprised. This event is not going to come to us like a thief in the night. Why? Verse 5, "For you are all children of light and children of the day. We are not of the night or of darkness. So then let us not fall asleep as others do, but let us keep awake and be sober." Okay? The most important verse then is verse 11. As he wraps up these statements, he says, "Therefore, encourage one another and build up each other as indeed you are doing." This is the second time in these 2 chapters that Paul says, encourage one another with these words. Encourage one another with these hopes about the future, about what God is going to do in the future. Encourage one another, right? He doesn't say inspire fear in one another. He doesn't say draw attention to your ability to pinpoint the very day of Christ's return. He doesn't say bludgeon one another with these words. He also doesn't say don't neglect this teaching, but he says encourage one another. So that the aim of thinking about the end isn't fear, isn't anxiety, it's hope and expectation. It's supposed to build us up together as a people. It's supposed to bring us together as a community of faith. And if it doesn't do that, then according to 1 Thessalonians, it's not Word of God. In a sense, for Paul, these reflections on the end are really about the present day. These reflections teach us how to live, not so much how to live then, but how to live now. If we miss this, I think we miss the very point of what Paul is talking about. Let's do another example. If you turn to the Gospel of Luke, to chapter 20. In these final chapters, Jesus finds himself in Jerusalem. And he's going to, in chapter 21, he's going to start speaking a word of judgment upon Jerusalem, upon what's going to happen in that city in the year 70 when the Romans come and destroy the city. And I think it's tempting for us to isolate those words of judgment from Jesus, but there's a wider context for all this. He has many controversies with the scribes and Pharisees leading up to chapter 20. Most striking for me is what he says about these religious leaders at the end of chapter 20. He says about them, verse 47, they devour widows' houses, and for the sake of appearance say long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation. And then there's a chapter break, which another one of these places in my Bible that drives me crazy, because the next story is very much about this. The next story is one that you're probably familiar with, but now hear it in light of what he says about these religious leaders. Remember, he says they devour widows' houses. So in chapter 21, he looked up and saw rich people putting their gifts into the treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 small copper coins. He said, truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For all of them I've contributed out of their abundance, but she out of her poverty has put in all she had to live on. Now, so often the way we read this story is that it's a commendation of her sacrifice. There's a little bit of that in here. But in light of what Jesus says about the religious leaders just before this, that they devour widows' houses, at the beginning of chapter 21, we see a vivid example of that happening in Jesus' very sight. Of a widow who's losing everything that she has. Now, one thing to remember about widows in the ancient world is that they're very vulnerable people. Because they don't have a husband or a son often to take care of them, they live in very precarious economic situations. This isn't the first time that Luke talks about widows. Earlier in the book, if you remember, the widow of Nain, do you remember this story? Right, where Jesus sees a widow and a dead son, and he goes and brings the son back. It's very curious to go back and read that story, is that Jesus has compassion on her, not the dead son. He has compassion on her. I think he sees her plight and wants to save her from her plight. And when he heals the son, he says, and he gave him back to her. That in a sense, who's being healed is the widow, not so much the son. Because she's the one that as she's carrying her dead son, it's her own funeral as well in the ancient world. He brings her back to life by bringing back her son. So that's, again, that's in the background here of this story. So this is the scene. And he'll talk about, Jesus will talk about this in a few verses here, is that you have this massive and beautiful temple. A place that God intended to be God's home, a place where people would worship, a place where people would be taken care of. But what's happening in the courts of that temple is that the people who can least afford to pay for this magnificent temple are the ones being burdened most of all. Okay? That's the context then when Jesus starts speaking about the judgment on Jerusalem that's going to come in the rest of chapter 21. So judgment has something to do with God's sense of justice. So it's not just God being a mean God trying to, punish the right people. It's not really about punishment. It's not really about vengeance. It's about justice. It's about a world in which a widow wouldn't have to sacrifice the very last penny she has to give to this massive edifice. That's the kind of vision of the end that Luke is giving us. Let's turn back to Revelation then, with those two things in mind. First, let's do a big picture in Revelation. Some of these things you probably already talked about, but when I teach Revelation, these are the 5 things I want everybody to remember. 6 things. I'm going to make that. The first thing is how Revelation begins. What's the first thing in Revelation? Is you have 7 letters, 7 churches. This isn't a book that's abstract and esoteric. It's very particular to these communities. And if you notice, these 7 communities are very different. They're not all the same. Some of them think too highly of themselves. Some of them are in the middle of oppression and are being persecuted. And all this revelation, this vision of Revelation, is being directed to each of these communities. So you that are doing well, know that there's a judgment upon the easy ways that you're walking through life. You that are being persecuted, know that God recognizes your faithfulness and will bring you back up. Right? So it's these 7 communities that are being spoken to, which suggests to me, number 2, that Revelation is not, again, abstract reflection. It's not some seer sitting in a cave somewhere writing these wonderful and weird images. It's a pastor thinking about these particular churches and their particular needs. It's a word of encouragement for some, a word of warning for others to these various communities. And that's how we have to read it. Number 3, then, I think this is very important to remember, is that the book was decipherable to its first audiences. The book was decipherable to its first audiences. Now, the first time I read Revelation, I remember this, I was a teenager, and I started reading it and I thought, this is a really strange book. I'm going to figure out what it means. Right? And I was interested in news and politics. I was trying to match up people. That's an instinct that we have, right? But it's the wrong way to read this text. Because it made sense to the people who first heard about it. So when they hear about a 7-headed dragon, we say, what in the world does that mean? But people in the ancient world know that Rome has 7 hills. Right? When they talk about one leader dying and another one rising in his place, they know what happens to the Caesars, and how when one dies, there's a big struggle for power in Rome. It's decipherable to them. They get it. They know the code, even if we don't. So I think part of the work we have to do to try to understand Revelation is try to get back there a little bit and figure out what the world was like for the people who first heard this book. 4th, then, and this is something that we saw in 1 Thessalonians and Luke as well, is that this book is about the present as much as it is about the future. It's as much about the present as it is about the future. When John writes Revelation, he doesn't say to the Laodiceans, just keep holding on, it's going to get better eventually. He says, this is God's future, so live right now as if God's future was present right now. Okay? 5th, this book is about faith and hope in the end, not fear or anxiety. It's about faith and hope in the end. We'll talk about some of the images that we see at the end of Revelation in just a moment. And last, then, is that this book is about justice, not revenge. It's not about punishing the wrongdoers. It's about setting the world right. And we want to punish those people who've harmed us. I mean, that's, I think, a human instinct. And I think that gets to the core of sometimes our sinfulness. But that's not what the book is about. It's about God's justice. All right. A couple places we can anchor our reading of Revelation. First is to look at Revelation 4 through 5, which you probably already talked about. And what do we get in Revelation 4 and 5? I think we get these 2 central images of the book, and images that we lose really easily because the rest of the book is so fantastic, right? You got dragons and you got the world falling apart. But at the core of Revelation isn't these fantastic images. It's not the stuff that's going to be on a movie theater screen. At the core of the book are 2 core central images. One is that you have God enthroned in the throne room, and then at the other hand you have a powerful lion who is also the lamb that was slain. That fundamentally the book of Revelation is not about the stuff that's going to happen in the future. It's about the character of God, about what kind of God God is. And God is a God of justice, a God of hope, a God of expectation, not a God of vengeance and fear and anxiety. That's the kind of God that we serve. That's the kind of God that's enthroned in chapter 4 with all those angels surrounding the throne. And then the second image we get then is of this powerful lion. Okay? This king of all beasts was roaming around. But at the same time that Jesus is a lion, he is also a lamb that was slain. A lamb whose life was taken. So it says something about God, that how does God claim power in the world? God doesn't claim power like Caesar does, by gathering an army of thousands of people. God claims power through the death of God's Son, Jesus Christ. So it's through sacrifice and weakness that power is actually achieved. We can be so easily distracted by the rest of this book. We can be distracted by the horsemen of the apocalypse riding in. We can get distracted by a dragon pursuing a pregnant woman. We can get distracted by all these big battles. But we must not forget that it is God and God's glory, Jesus and his power through weakness, that is at the center of this book. Without those two things, this book doesn't make any sense. So we get to the end of the book, Revelation 21. The last vision in Revelation is of the New Jerusalem. Okay, it's a city that comes down from the heavens. I think it's important that it's a city. It's a place where people are gathered and are kind of living shoulder to shoulder. Okay? Other thing to remember is that, and we kind of got a glimpse of this last week, is that ancient cities are typically very crowded, very noisy, and very dirty places. Right? You have people like living right next to each other. You don't have good sanitation, you don't have good sewage systems. So it's striking then at the end of Revelation, it's a city where God lives and where God's people live. Right? It's a city that brings all these people together, and it's a beautiful place. What is and isn't there? There's a list of things that Revelation will talk about that's missing from Jerusalem. The sea is gone. Now, I grew up on an island in Puerto Rico, so I like the sea, I like going to the beach. So I don't like this New Jerusalem very much. But what's important to remember is context here. For ancient Judaism, the sea, and for a lot of the ancient world, the sea is not a place you go to relax. The sea is a place when you get on a boat, you never know what's going to happen. The shipwrecks are very common. They don't have modern ways to tell what the weather is going to be like, so the storm can come at any moment and take you out. It's a place of fear. It's a place of chaos. It's a place where people like animals like Leviathan live. There might be dragons under there. We just don't know. But that's gone. See? So that fear is gone. That fear of the sea is gone. What else is gone? Death is gone. Death is no more. That great enemy of all of us. And here I think Revelation is not talking just about that, that final breath that we take and when lives are taken from us. I think he's also talking about the way that death infects so much of our lives through illness, through brokenness, a child that's taken too early, a disease that ravages us. That's the kind of death, that power of death that is no more in this new city. There are no more tears and mourning and crying. Again, because death is gone. There are no evil, unclean, or accursed things or persons. All gone. Strikingly, in this big, beautiful city, there is no temple. And the problem here isn't that the temple is a bad place. It's not that that Revelation is so much criticizing the temple. Revelation is saying is that in this city, the presence of God so permeates every square meter of this place that there is no need for a place that we call the house of God, because God is truly everywhere and with us. There is no sun, there is no moon, there is no other luminaries, and yet there is no night. Okay, so there's no sun, no moon, no stars, and there is never any night. And here's why that's important, is we're used to, when it gets dark, what do? We turn on all the lights. But think about a world in which we have no electricity. I mean, half of Manhattan was experiencing this for some time. Think about the fear that would come over us. That's all gone. Light is always around. And last, I think most strikingly, is that in this big city with huge walls, there are no closed gates. The gates are always wide open. Okay? So why do you build these walls? and yet have the doors wide open. There's a sense at the end of Revelation that the city is open to anyone who would be willing to come in. That as soon as they step into the city, they will be cleansed, they will be made whole. That the city at the end isn't about kicking everybody out, it's about flinging the gates open for anyone who might come. The world ultimately in Revelation is transformed. It's not destroyed and rebuilt, right? God can't do this anymore, right? God can't destroy the world. God has made promises to Noah. The world instead is transformed. The presence of God is that much more palpable in this city. And in the end, we get the reconciliation of all peoples, as difficult as this is to imagine today. So, 7 things I would leave us with then, about how we think about the end. First is that eschatology and thinking about the end is not about providing a roadmap to the end of days. It's not about telling us X happens and then Y happens and then Z happens. Eschatology instead is a radical way to shape how we relate to God and one another right now, today. It's about a posture of trust in God and God's work. It's not about bold predictions about days yet to come. It's about seeing the work of God in seemingly ordinary, seemingly unremarkable moments. Number 2 is I think that neither neglect nor fantastic imagination are sufficient substitutes in our reading of Revelation. So it's not just enough to go into these crazy imaginative adventures about what the end might be like. That's not enough, and it's also not enough not to read the book. All right? There's a middle ground there to be drawn. Third, Christian eschatology is fundamentally about hope in the future and trust in a God who will not break promises. That's what it's fundamentally about. Too often, Christian eschatology has opted for fear and anxiety. We worry that the world is falling apart and want to know that God is going to save us in the end. Instead, Christian eschatology ought to look at this frustrating mixture of brokenness and good we see in the world and trust that God is a God of justice and righteousness. Fourth, Christian eschatology does not look forward to our victory, but to the victory of God. It's not about us winning in the end. It's not about our team winning in the end. It's about God's victory in the end. Eschatology is not really about me and my security. It's not about you and your security. Eschatology really is about a faithful, loving, and just God. It's not about us. It's about who God is. And who is that God? Number 5. This God is a loving God that cannot tolerate a world of injustice, but is always working toward a just reign with no end. It's not about revenge. It's about justice in the end. So last, my encouragement to you is to read Revelation, read 1 Thessalonians, read the Gospel of Luke, and read this good news and realize that we can step into the future with boldness and hope, despite the many ways that realities around us will cause us to lose sight of God's promises. We can live as a people of hope and expectation, even when it looks like the world is falling apart. I want to show you one more movie clip for us to think about, and I'll take some questions then at the end. Everybody seen the movie Wall-E? All right, so you probably have seen it. So it's a movie about this little robot, right? Its job in the world is to clean up, right? The world, for some reason, you find out later in the movie why, everybody's gone from the earth. So Wall-E is just left alone in this city, and he's cleaning stuff up. And I think he teaches us an important thing about eschatology here. we learn from Wall-E? I think we learned a couple things. One, we learned that cockroaches are really resilient. They're always going to be around. We can't get away from them. But in the end, when everything else is gone, and all we're left with is what's really valuable in this world. How do we make those judgments about what's really valuable in the world? So if you notice, he likes to collect things that are interesting and useful. So he was collecting, he finds that ring box, and he finds this big rock, and he tosses it because it's not that interesting, it's not that valuable. That box, though, it's interesting. There's some value to it. When it all comes down to the end, what is it that's really important? What is it that we hold on to when everything else is gone? That's what Christian eschatology is about. And what we hold on to is a God who loves us, a God we can trust, a God who does not break promises, a God who's going to be with us to the very end, a God who promises that death is not the final word. That's what Revelation's about. It's not about some crazy dragon. It's not about all these fantastic images. It's not about sitting in a movie theater and being entertained by what these things are. It's about hope in God's future. And it's also about the call that God has upon our lives then. If God has his future in store for us, what does that mean for how I treat my neighbor today? That's what this stuff is about. One quick plug. I did write a bit on Revelation for the Book of Faith series, so if you're curious about some more of this stuff, it's a good resource. But enough of a commercial. Any questions? We have 5 minutes. Good. Yes?
You asked earlier why in good times, looking at the end.
Mm-hmm.
And Mother Teresa may have answered that comment recently. How do you define what really is a good time? Apparently, her first visit to New York, in front of a huge crowd, someone stuck a microphone in front of her, people were really living a good life. And her comment was she'd never seen so many hungry people in one place in their life. What they thought they had, really, they're hungry for others.
Yeah. So the comment was a comment that Mother Teresa made when she came to New York and was speaking to a large group of people. And she said that she'd never seen, people who are well off, right? She'd never seen such a crowd of more hungry people in her life. And this is Mother Teresa. She's seen some hungry people. She had seen some hungry people in her life. I think there's a truth to that I think one of the things that eschatology can help us do is to imagine a really different world. Imagine a world turned upside down. Imagine a world in which, you know, your checking account doesn't determine your value in this world. And where you happen to be born doesn't determine whether or not you go to school, or whether what your gender is doesn't determine whether or not you have a good life in front of you. And it's about questioning what the good life really is. What does it really look like? And what is it that's really valuable in the end? So it's not having that diamond ring, it's about something else. I think there's something really true about that. Thanks. Other comments, other questions? Yes, sir, in the back.
So let me just read to you an example of a verse that I personally basically have to reject from Revelation. It says, I heard the voice of a fourth living creature call out, "Come." And I looked, and there was a pale green horse. His rider's name was Death, and Hades followed with him. They were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword, famine, and pestilence by the wild animals of the earth.
Yeah.
Nobody talks about what we do with this. It's awful.
Yes.
It's not,
Yep.
you know, I mean, when I read stuff, and you know, stuff like that is all over Revelation.
Yeah. And even the way that Revelation thinks about women is deeply problematic. There's a lot of scholarship about this. So I think you're right. I think the book isn't easy to read, not just because some of the code language is obscure, but because some of the theological conclusions it seems to reach are downright seem wrong to us. And I think that's a really good example of that. I think part of what's happening there is acknowledgement of what the world is really like for people in the ancient world, in which pestilence is something that they live with on a daily basis. That a fourth of the world being destroyed by a famine, yeah, that happens. That this is part of the way that the world functions. But notice then what happens in the end is that's the way the world works. What does the New Jerusalem look like? There is no pestilence, there is no death. All that stuff is gone. it's the world kind of having these growing pains and leading that way.
But
Yeah.
you talked about the end. It was said this morning, even right before the end, you have a bunch of people being thrown into a lake of fire.
Mm-hmm.
That is like
Yep.
the prologue to heaven coming down.
Yep. I think that one of the things that I think I often struggle with, that you might struggle with as well, is thinking about God's love and God's judgment at the same time. I think we tend to think of those as two different things, that God loves us all, but then can God judge us? Can those two things hold together? And I think for the New Testament, those are two sides of the same coin, that God can't love us if God doesn't judge us. And God can't judge us if God doesn't love us either. I mean, there's a sense in which those two things work together. And that if a world is going to be transformed, there is some sense of judgment that comes along with God's justice. Not that this stuff is easy to resolve at all. I think that's exactly the kind of questions we have to ask about this text, to grapple with. Because these are tensions found throughout the text. Now, one of the things, I mentioned this earlier, Revelation is really good at counting stuff, right? There's 144,000 of this and 12,000 of that. What's the one thing that Revelation can't count? Is that when there's this mass of people gathered in front of the throne room of God, all dressed in white, for the first time, John says, the crowd was too great to count. So you can count 144,000 apparently really easily. But when he looks at this massive crowd of people gathered before the throne, they're innumerable. You have these open gates at the end. You have that then in tension with some of these images then as well, of judgment, of lake of fire, of pestilence and death reigning in the end. And I think that's part of the struggle of our faith, is how do you hold these two things together? Yeah.
I find one thing that quite interesting is the fact that the picture of Jerusalem with all the gold and all the precious minerals of the world and everything, and, that was one thing throughout it that we were to reject when we were on Earth. And yet here in Jerusalem, there's all of this.
Yeah, it's striking so that you have this image, this city characterized by all its wealth, right? Its gold streets, and so I think what it is that Revelation is trying to capture the kind of beauty of the place and the kind of extravagance of God's generosity. So it's less about, oh great, I mean, I have enough money that I can create a street of gold. That's pretty cool. It's about, it's a symbol of God's generosity, I think, in the end. So it is striking then to have, again, I think there's all these tensions in the book that aren't easily resolved or ever really resolved. I think that's part of the challenge of faith, is that we hold this belief that God loves us and that God will also judge the world. And so how do these two things hold together? I think that's part of our struggle. And one thing that we need each other to do this. One last thing before I forget, and we'll get to your question, is that I would suggest that none of us read this stuff by ourselves. We need the help of one another and of good study Bibles and things like that. This is the kind of work that we do together. Yes, sir, last question.
I presume you pose these same questions to your students. What response do you get from them?
That's a good question. Oh, so yeah, my students probably ask a lot of these same questions, and what do I tell them? I think one thing that, I think it's true that I would tell them, and I would tell you just the same thing, is that faith isn't easily resolvable. It's not about easy questions. If there's an easy answer, that's not faith, right? So what we do then, what we do for one another, what I teach my students to do as pastors, and what I hope you do for one another as brothers and sisters in faith, is invite people into those spaces of tension and not try to solve those problems right away. One of the temptations our students, and I think a lot of us who are professors and pastors, one of our temptations is that somebody asks us a question and we think, oh, I'm just going to answer it. Right? I've got all this theological training. I know that I can read Greek. I gotta know this. But that for us, when it comes to these questions of faith, it's not about the answer often. It's about being able to express out loud our deepest hopes and our deepest anxieties and fears, and verbalizing them and having somebody else hear them, and then receiving them and not trying to fix them away or trying to say, oh, you shouldn't be afraid, God loves you, or yeah, that's good, stick on with the hope or whatever. It's that we want to hear one another. We want to hear about one another's experiences. So I hope that's something that we can do for one another. So that's what I tell my students as well, is that they're not answer people, they're pastors. And you are not answer peoples for one another. You're siblings, you're brothers and sisters. I believe we're out of time.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.